Greek mythology, probably one of the most well-known ancient religions in the West. This multitude of gods, goddesses, heroes, and monsters has spawned hundreds of books, movies, musicals, video games, you name it. But something we sometimes forget is that these figures don't just exist. They were created by ancient Greeks thousands of years ago, and taking a look at what the culture was actually like and what the gods or goddesses stood for, or how they were viewed then, can be quite interesting. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go over every single member of the Greek pantheon, but I can talk about two gods in particular who are excellent examples for our purpose. So, here we go. Now, you've probably heard of Athena, but let's do a quick recap for those who have not. Athena, daughter of Zeus and most definitely not Hera, was the goddess of many things, but is most well known as the goddess of wisdom and war. Unlike her half-brother Ares, who represented bloodlust, death, and dumb war, Athena represented the strategical, tactical, smart war. In many cases where Ares would fail, Athena would succeed. Athena was also highly regarded in both Sparta and Athens, since both had strong military operations. Now this is actually pretty interesting, since most people would think of ancient Greece being strictly patriarchal. If women had no respect or position in life, or at least not how we'd think of it, then why would Athena, a goddess, be so highly respected and revered as a patron of traditionally masculine things? Unfortunately, I don't have a solid answer for that. Some speculate that Ares was a later addition to the pantheon from a foreign religion, and thus less well known or liked. However, what I think is even more interesting is how Athena's position compares to the treatment of women in the various Greek city-states. Let's look at two of her more well-known worshippers. Spartan treatment of women was fairly in line with how they revered Athena. Since Sparta was an extremely militaristic culture, the men were frequently away, well, fighting. In order to accommodate this, women were allowed a great deal of freedom, both personally and publicly. Women could own property, something that in many cultures was the equivalent to high status or citizenship, were highly respected as the mothers of future Spartan warriors, and allowed high levels of education. On the grand scale of ancient cultures, women had it pretty great. Athens, Athena's city, surely a city that places so much importance on a female goddess would... Athens' culture was more like how most people picture ancient civilizations to be. Women weren't allowed to take part in politics, own property, or even be considered citizens. Even slaves could gain all those things if they became free. Now, I could be misreading all of this. After all, I am a modern woman looking at this from a modern perspective, so my lens is pretty tinted by modern values. However, it is fascinating to me that while Athena was the goddess of wisdom, women in Athens were denied education. Speaking of Athens, there is actually a myth that describes how Athena became the patron of the city. Okay, so Athens had just been built, and it was time to pick a deity to dedicate it to. Poseidon, you know, king of the sea, brother of Zeus, nobody too important, was all like,
"Hey, you should dedicate your city to me!"
But then Athena was all like, "No, dedicate your city to me!" Time for an epic showdown! Both gods would create something for the people of Athens, then the people would pick their favorite, and that god would become the city's new patron. So, Poseidon whips up a little saltwater spring, because, you know, sea god, and Athena creates the first olive tree. The Athenian people decided that the olive tree was way more practical and useful in the long term than a fountain of undrinkable water, so they picked Athena. She won the contest, became the patron of Athens, and thus began the rivalry of Athena and Poseidon. Oh boy, this is gonna be a long one. If you know anything about Greek mythology, chances are you know Hades. But do you really? Hades as we know him is vastly different from the Hades of myth. But before we get too far into it, let's do some backstory. Hades was the eldest son of Kronos and Rhea and the oldest brother of Zeus. When the gods defeated Kronos, he, Zeus, and Poseidon drew straws to see who'd rule what. Poseidon got the oceans, Zeus got the sky, and Hades the underworld. As Lord of the Underworld, it was Hades' job to decide who went where when they died, and to make sure that the souls stayed put. Hades is most frequently portrayed in modern media as a devil, or at least the villain. Disney has two examples of this in their own works: The Goddess of Spring, a silly symphony short, and, of course, Hercules. Both of these portray the underworld as a thoroughly unpleasant or hell-like landscape, with the man himself appearing as a devil or as a snarky villain with a Claudius complex. The first Percy Jackson film also gives Hades a villainous role, despite him only really veering into anti-hero in the books, if even that. The problem with these portrayals is that it couldn't be further from how Hades is in mythology. Hades' character in mythology is much less evil than anyone wants to give him credit for. Granted, his best-known myth is the one where he kidnaps Persephone to make her his wife, more on that later, but in the grand scheme of things, especially compared to the other gods, Zeus, he was pretty chill. The ancient Greeks saw him as a grim and cold figure who held all his subjects equally accountable to the laws of the underworld, but he was never thought of as evil, and he never sought to overthrow his brother. Now, to say that Hades wasn't evil doesn't mean he wasn't feared. I mean, look at what happened to Theseus and Pirithous that time they wanted to kidnap Persephone. People just didn't want to attract his attention because, as previously stated, he had the final say on where you ended up in the underworld. Now, speaking of the underworld, there were three options for where your soul went. The Fields of Asphodel, a sort of limbo where you went if you were just a run-of-the-mill person. Elysium, where the great heroes went. And finally, Tartarus, which was basically hell. And this brings us to our next point. You may have heard the underworld be referred to as Hades. That's because Hades' name was used to mean the underworld as a whole, not just the god. Centuries later, when the Bible was first translated into Greek, the word Hades was used to refer to hell. Several centuries of this usage later, and we arrive at Hades being conflated with both hell and Satan. There is a growing number of people who oppose this comparison and actively strive to defend him, though they often have their work cut out for them because I said I'd cover this, so here we go. Our story begins when Hades fell in love with Persephone, daughter of Demeter and goddess of spring. Hades wanted to marry Persephone, so he went to talk to her father Zeus. Zeus approved of the match, but knew that Demeter would not. So, being the great brother that he was, Zeus said,
"Why don't you just take her?"
And Hades said,
"Sure, there's absolutely no way this could go badly."
So he kidnapped her. Persephone's side of the myth was never really explored, but one thing most tellings agree on is that she wasn't too keen on this arrangement. Neither was her mother, who, in her grief, killed all the plant life on Earth, saying that if she didn't get her daughter back, she'd let all of humanity starve. Yeesh. Zeus, not wanting his source of prayers and romantic antics to die out, commanded that Hades return Persephone to her mother. Which he did, but not before giving Persephone a few pomegranate seeds to eat. Since she had eaten food from the underworld, Persephone wouldn't be able to permanently leave. In order to appease both Demeter and Hades, Zeus decreed that since Persephone had only eaten a few seeds, the exact number varies by myth, she would only have to stay a part of the year with Hades. Again, the exact amount of time varies. So, every year when Persephone leaves her mother, all the plants die and Earth goes through winter. And when she comes back, everything grows again. Thus, the seasons. Now, despite this being the myth where Hades does what many call the worst thing he ever did, the events can actually be explained as an exaggerated depiction of what actually went down in ancient Athens. Back then, a marriage was a business contract between the groom and the bride's father, and the girl in question's consent was not needed. In fact, the father didn't even have to tell his daughter that he was arranging a marriage for her. Then, once the marriage happened, the girl would leave her home, go live with her new husband's family, and probably never see her mother again because women in Athens couldn't travel across the city. So Hades was just following convention. Does that make his kidnapping her right? Well, no. But it's not as bad as some tellings make it out to be. And many modern mythology enthusiasts like to believe that Hades and Persephone found happiness in their marriage. If nothing else, they remained faithful to each other and had the least drama-filled relationship of the gods, relatively speaking. So what have we learned? Athena's position of honor and respect certainly adds a level of complication to how we perceive ancient Greece, especially Athens. The dissonance of how she was revered versus how women were treated is fascinating, and unfortunately, we don't have anyone from that time to clarify why this was. Haney's evolution of depiction is also extremely interesting, as his modern depictions are so vastly different from his original characterization. And don't get me wrong, I love Disney's rendition of the character, but I do wish more people would be willing to portray him as he actually is.